I've been having some issues with my Yamaha 200 with starting. The problem being it runs on one cylinder but not the other, and I've checked the spark and it's got a good spark on both, and I'm getting some intermittent starting on the other cylinder, but it's not consistent. And I think a lot of the problem is down to the fact that all these bikes are stood for quite a long time, and I think the fuel gets a bit gungy. Also, with the bikes being old and older, the tank looks great on the inside. Who knows if there's any sort of crud and bits of rust on the bottom which is coming through and blocking the carburetors. So based on that thought, I'm going to take the carburetor off on the other side, clean it, and see if I can get this bike running on both cylinders. And then once I've done that, I'm going to drain the fuel off, see how much I've got in there, top it up to say 2 or 3 litres, and then I plan to put in this Honda fuel stabilizer, which is supposed to work on both 2 and 4-stroke bikes, and I shall probably do that across all my bikes. So for now I'm just going to whip this carburetor off, or the one on the other side, and get that cleaned. So the first thing to do is just whip out the throttle slider, which is a case of just unscrewing this cap. And I'll just take that needle, tuck it out of the way. The next thing to do is remove this rubber boot. These can be a bit fiddly. I've actually loosened that one off already. Need to be careful not to split this rubber boot. There it goes. Well, it's just a case of fiddling that off. Ah, that's interesting. We have a wire out here. Has that got something to do with it? One wonders. Right, next thing to do is to start the bike again and see if this wire that was loose, I've just noticed, this was actually off. So this may have something to do with it. Although it appears to go to the brake light switch. That's interesting. But anyway, I'll just see if I can get the bike to start based on that. So the bike has had a little start, but it's coughing and spluttering off this near side cylinder. So I'm still convinced that there's an issue with the fuel. Yeah, so I'm still convinced there's a issue with this carburetor, so I'm going to take it off anyway and clean it. It deserves it. So that's just a pinch bolt on the top there, which is fairly straightforward, and that carburetor will now come off. That's the fuel line off, and there will be a bit of fuel still in the carburetor. Clean that all up. So I've just inverted the carburetor just to get all the fuel out and give it a good clean on the outside. The bowl's probably full, and then we'll see what we see on this. Right, so let's get this dismantled and in the cleaner. First thing to do is to remove these 4 screws on the bottom of the float chamber, and I would recommend you use one of these Japanese screw drivers. They are different to a Phillips or other crossheads in that they actually fit these correctly. Using a standard Phillips or a crosshead can actually damage these nuts, so I would highly recommend getting the correct screwdrivers. They're retained by 4 spring clips and the 4 screws. They're not very tight, so I am expecting that these have been cleaned before, certainly removed. Now there may still be some fuel left in there, so I've got my trusty blue workshop cloth just to make sure that we don't get anything nasty happening. So there you go. Yeah, there is quite a lot of crud in the bottom of the carburetor. So the next thing to do is to take these floats out. So to remove these floats, this little pin here just gets pushed out. And that releases the float. Okay. Be very careful with the gasket, as I don't know the availability with those. I'm going to retain that one. It looks fairly good, to be honest. Right, next bit is to take these jets out. This little component here is the float valve seating, and that has got a little spring on it which pushes the float back up when it's in position, and that can be dismantled, but as it has nothing to do with the fuel going in and out the carburetor, I'm not going to touch that. I am going to take the jets out here though and clean those as well. So that's my next bit, to get that out. Having said that about the retainer there, this actually does come out, so I think it's quite important just to put it to one side. There it is, and it's got that little spring in the end, tiny little thing. Disappointingly, that is actually quite clean, but anyway, I'm going to put it all into the bath and see how that all pans out. So that is the main jet out, and now I just have to take the pilot jet out, which is this one here. And that is it as far as a strip down that I'm going to do. Everything else seemed to be running okay, so I'm not going to adjust the throttles or the air screws or anything like that. I'm just going to clean it and put it back together and make sure that everything's clean on that one. So I have here a sonic cleaner, and what that does is it vibrates at a very high frequency and cleans all the rubbish out of the carburetor. I've got some ultrasonic cleaning fluid here, which you mix 10 parts water to 1 part concentrate. So I've got my jug and I've got my fluid, and so I'm just going to load this up. It recommends to run the temperature between 50 and 80 degrees C. Now this particular machine doesn't have a heater on it, so I'm going to have to use the water out of a kettle, check with a thermometer that I'm at the right temperature, and then we'll take it from there and put the parts in and clean them. So I'm just loading sonic cleaner with the water. And I have this little basket which I'm going to load the components into. I'm not going to bother with that stainless steel spring retainer. I don't think it's necessary. It's really the jets I'm worried about, so they're the bits I'm going to put in with the carb body and see how much of that I can get submerged. And it's on. So I'll just leave that until the counter's gone, and I can put the components then into some fresh water, clean them, dry them off, and then reassemble the carb. Or, as my dad's army instructor said, you dismantle it here and remantle it over there. That's cleaned up pretty nicely, all the brass. I'm just going to pop it back in again for another 90 seconds on the other side, just to give it a good clean on that side too. So I've put the main jet back in. I've just tightened up the pilot jet as well, just with a little fine screwdriver in that slot there. So the next thing to do is put in the float spring retainer. So these little things are pointed, really sharp pointy end on there, and that just drops into that slot there, and that's got that little bit of springiness to it, and then that goes on there. Come on, there you go. Just make sure that all moves freely. Yep, I've put the gasket back in as well, and as soon as the bowl comes out of the cleaner, I'll dry and clean that up, and that'll go back on again. So I've refitted the carburetor back in place. It was a simple process of just reverse of what I did to take it out. So that's all back in. Actually gives really good access to getting all the fuel lines back in properly. I had a vent come off, and this fuel line wasn't on particularly well, so with the carburetor off there's plenty of room to sort out the routing of the fuel lines and the air lines. So we're good to go. Hopefully we'll get a start on it. I'll go around the other side to start it, because then I can operate the petrol pipe and the choke. Okay, so the fuel is a bit low, so I'm on the reserve position. Put the ignition on, and we've got a good green light to go there. Bit of choke, and of course this being the YS5E, it's got electric start. Look at that, perfect. Both firing, perfect. One thing you have to be a little bit careful about on this next operation is don't burn yourself. So yep, both the pipes are getting warm, which means both cylinders are running. So that's been a pretty simple fix. Clean the carburetor out. So the next job will be to drain this tank completely, just by taking the petrol pipe off here, and then I'll add the fuel stabilizer in, and then I'll start on the Honda and do exactly the same thing. So that's been a result. Good.